Welcome to the debate. Today, we dive headfirst into one of the most difficult and consequential arguments in modern history: how we define the historical legacy of Mao Zedong. For any student of 20th century China, the central tension is just unavoidable.
And that tension, it really crystallizes into a very stark question, one that's drawn from highly critical material like, Chang and Halliday's biography. Was Mao a monster? It's a question of moral judgment, of course, but it's also a profound challenge to our historical methodology.
Absolutely. And the debate we're having today is whether history should prioritize the leader's destructive intent and the appalling human cost, or if it must be defined by his systemic transformative impact on the nation. My position is clear. The evidence detailing Mao's unique destructive political goals and the sheer scale of the suffering he caused, it necessitates the application of the monster framework.
I believe that framework is frankly too reductive. It fails a test of comprehensive historical analysis. While we must never ever diminish the catastrophic errors and the millions of deaths, history just requires a broader lens. So I'll be arguing that focusing exclusively on personal vileness obscures Mao's critical role in unifying China, initiating its modernization, and elevating its global standing.
Well, let's start with intent then, because the unique psychological disposition described by his critics is, I think, what really sets him apart. Chang and Halliday argue he actively desired a completely arid society devoid of civilization. This wasn't just, generic authoritarianism, it was an ideological commitment to the active denial of human feeling.
That's a powerful, truly devastating charge. It suggests a leader whose motivation was fundamentally nihilistic, almost completely divorced from the revolutionary goals he was publicly espousing.
Precisely. He aimed to make the entire nation brain dead, simply to facilitate his purges and ensure that unquestioning obedience became the bedrock of the state. When you systematically purge religion, when you denounce the foundational morality of Confucius and Co., which was a campaign designed to eradicate traditional civility, you are defining your regime not by political objectives, but by the systemic suppression of basic humanity. His critics insist the ruthlessness, the total control, it meant he was more extreme than Hitler or Stalin.
I acknowledge the absolute necessity of that moral critique, I do. But when we transition from moral condemnation to historical analysis, we hit a wall. History, especially for global figures of this magnitude, requires us to understand causation beyond just individual psychology. I believe that focusing so tightly on Mao's personal violence, it risks offering a very incomplete historical picture.
But if that unique vileness is the engine of the destruction, if his desire for extreme permanence, for a state of perpetual revolutionary struggle, is what drove the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, how can we possibly treat that as secondary?
Because that framework risks excluding the massive political, social, and economic factors that drove the revolution itself and the context of the world in 1949. We can't allow the emotional power of the critique to overwhelm the historian's duty to complexity. We have to look at what Mao achieved.
And what was that achievement? Measured against millions of lives?
Transformation. It was transformation. As the material reminds us, he unified a country that had been fragmented by civil war and foreign incursions for decades. He established China as a globally recognized power. And crucially, he began the essential work of modernization. Massive strides were made in public health, education, and life expectancy. The common person, for the first time, had access to standards of living that were previously unimaginable.
But those gains, significant as they might be, they're always prefaced by a dark asterisk, aren't they? They are inseparable from the colossal failures of the Great Leap Forward and the sheer chaos of the Cultural Revolution.
Inseparable, yes, but they must be weighed as part of the total impact. Some view him as a socialist hero who inspires awe for his efforts to empower the common people by struggling against entrenched bureaucracy. He transformed China from a semi-colonial backwater into a world power. To take that immense structural change and reduce it to the actions of merely a monster is a methodological choice that excludes major historical forces.
I see why you think that narrative offers greater historical depth. But I would argue the exact opposite is true. If we prioritize the idea that the leader's destructive intent is secondary to the political context, we fundamentally change the narrative. If Mao wanted the nation to be brain-dead to facilitate his big purge, as his critics allege, then his intent is the defining systemic factor.
But this is where historians often diverge. When scholars critique these highly personalized biographies, the ones focusing on Mao's cruelty, they argue it can undermine the power of the history by neglecting alternative explanations for events. They suggest that by turning a complex political movement into the story of a psychopath, we miss the structural failures, the cult of personality, the failure of the central planning mechanism, the power struggles within the party itself.
I would challenge that framing entirely. I'm not convinced that moving the focus away from his calculated cruelty actually adds depth. I think it risks diffusing responsibility. His commitment to creating a society devoid of civilization through the systemic suppression of human feelings, that is the alternative explanation. No one denies the importance of famine or political structure, but what other leader elevated the denial of human feeling to an active long-term policy goal? That unique feature demands we prioritize his psychological profile.
That takes us directly into the heart of the second contention. How do we measure that devastating intent against transformative impact? If we accept the premise of mass murder, does any amount of modernization offset that moral calculus?
It absolutely does not. The sheer scale of the human cost, the millions lost in the Great Leap Forward, it simply cannot be balanced against material gains. We are dealing with a personality who was determined to force history to bend to his will, to live in a state of extreme perpetual revolution. His so-called utopian dreams, whatever their initial promise, resulted in an unparalleled catastrophe. The historian must prioritize the cost.
That is a compelling argument, and it's rooted in deep moral concern. But we have to ground this in the historical reality of 1949. China was a defeated, impoverished, and divided nation. Mao rescued it from that semi-colonial status. He established China as a state that the rest of the world could not ignore. We are talking about a leader whose aim, according to some analyses, was to start a Chinese golden age.
And the road to that golden age was paved with the bones of millions. The moral challenge of using the term transformative impact is that it implies a necessary evil. Were the millions of deaths necessary for unification and modernization? I find that premise untenable.
The challenge lies in integration. Philip Short, who is arguably the most authoritative biographer in our source material, suggested we must view him in a balanced way, as a flawed colossus. The term colossus is key there. It implies immense historical weight and achievement, someone who fundamentally reshaped the continent. To treat him merely as a monster negates the vastness of that achievement, even if the flawed part addresses the cruelty.
But that framework suggests an equivalence, doesn't it? A kind of 50-50 balancing act between modernization and mass atrocity. If a leader achieves modernization through methods arguably more extreme than Hitler or Stalin, then the moral priority must go to the destruction. It seems to me that attempting to integrate his role as a transformative leader risks minimizing the calculated, personalized cruelty that drove the purges.
But we also have to address the long-term context. Extract 5 suggests that his true stature should be a matter of waiting to see how China developed long after his death. This suggests that the ultimate judgment of his transformation hinges on the success of the modern Chinese state, a success he fundamentally enabled.
So if we turn to the ideological contradictions then for our third contention, can we truly separate the alleged socialist hero who struggled against bureaucracy from the brutal architect of the Cultural Revolution?
Well, ideologically, the struggle was against the consolidation of a new class elite, which is a core component of Maoist theory, perpetual revolution to prevent political stagnation. He successfully transformed China and led a genuine mass revolution that brought about vast, tangible improvements to life expectancy to health standards. The credit for those material, measurable achievements that benefited the common people, it must be given.
I am highly skeptical of that line of reasoning. The Cultural Revolution was not some pure anti-bureaucratic crusade. It was an organized, state-sanctioned purge, a tool of personal rule designed to eliminate rivals and enforce Mao's personal cult. The attack on criticized Lin Biao and Confucius shows that it was fundamentally an effort to stamp out any thought, any tradition, any person that stood outside of Mao's immediate ideological control.
While the Cultural Revolution was horrific and destructive, its stated purpose was rooted in an ideological commitment to empowering the masses against those who had become stagnant within the party structure. We have to analyze the ideological goal, even as we condemn the implementation. The legacy is complex because the man was both the emancipator and the executioner.
But the ultimate result of that commitment was the systematic denial of human feelings and the creation of a society devoid of civility. The very structure of the society he created, defined by ideological purity enforced through terror, ultimately undermined any purported goal of genuinely empowering the common people. They were empowered to carry out purges, not to think independently. The monster framework, for me, captures the totality of this destruction of intellect and spirit.
And I maintain that the historian must grapple with the contradictions. You cannot simply discard the undeniable fact that hundreds of millions of people saw their lives irrevocably changed for the better because of the revolution he initiated. To dismiss Mao as merely a monster means we miss the immense, flawed historical agency he possessed.
To summarize my position then, while the complexity is vast, the sheer weight of evidence regarding Mao's psychological commitment to absolute destructive control, his desire to create a nation of the brain dead, it compels us to adopt the interpretation that centers on his destructive power. When intent is so clear and the human cost so astronomical, that intent must define his historical legacy, even if he did achieve geopolitical unification.
And my conclusion is that while the moral critique is essential, the historical assessment must be viewed in a balanced way. We have to integrate his role as the transformative leader who unified China and initiated modernization, viewing him as the flawed colossus who engineered fundamental change. A singular focus on the monster label simply provides an insufficient explanation for the scope of his impact.
The struggle over Mao's character really highlights the tension at the heart of historical study. Choosing whether to prioritize moral intent or transformative structural impact leads to fundamentally different, yet still evidence-based conclusions.
Indeed. And looking ahead, the material also makes clear that the path China took after Mao's death, under Deng Xiaoping, focusing on economic liberalization and global engagement, it demonstrates a profound reevaluation of Mao's ideological path. The long-term success or failure of Deng's policies arguably forms the next chapter in the material, which certainly warrants our continued exploration.